Give it up for Mr. Sean Maddigan.
Thanks, Andrew. All right, let's start with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Father, we thank you for this day. Thank you for creating us. Thank you for redeeming us in your Son. We ask you fill us with your Holy Spirit. Help us to glorify you with everything we have. We praise you for the gift of marriage in particular, and that witness that is to your presence among us, your love among us, and as an image of Christ's love for the church. And we entrust all of our intentions to Marys who say, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Okay, so as Andrew had said, I teach over at St. John Paul II. This is my 5th year teaching there, and 9th year teaching overall. I teach to the sophomores, juniors, and seniors. You might be wondering, like, man, how did this guy get stuck with this topic, the contraception, encyclical? I'm actually excited about this topic. It's something I teach to the seniors every year there, and so it's going to be good as we go through this encyclical. Humanae Vitae, which is written by St. Papal VI. He's actually a canonized saint, one of the more recently canonized saints, and so he also was the Pope who presided over the end of the Second Vatican Council, which is the most recent ecumenical council in church history. And so he's a pretty big deal, big deal as a Pope, so I'm looking forward to getting into it. So what this translates to is, Humanae Vitae just means of human life, okay? And then the subtitle underneath the encyclical was on the regulation of birth. And so that's going to be the topic that he's addressing, the modern issue that he's addressing. In the series that you guys have seen so far, you've seen the popes address global issues, some more regional, having to do with war, economics, moral issues. This is going to be taking place in the context of a very confusing middle of the 20th century, a lot of socioeconomic issues happening, a lot of pressure on the church to change its teaching, and he's going to write this as a response to that. And so in the next slide here, there's 3 groups. When I jokingly say, how I get stuck with this encyclical is that historically speaking, this is probably the least popular encyclical ever released. It was absolutely hated by a lot of people when it was released because the people pushing for change didn't get what they wanted. And so in the wake of it, there was a lot of controversy. But as time has gone on, this encyclical has really been ratified by the cultural changes that have happened since 1968, which is when this is written. And we're going to go over that. And one of the reasons I'm excited to talk about this encyclical in particular is I found that it has a lot of personal value for marriages, individual relationships, but then also as a large scale issue within society. I don't think a lot of people realize just how much this encyclical predicted would happen, and how accurate it's been in kind of summing up the effects of contraception on the culture. And but within the church, I would say that there's a lot of groups. Among all Catholic moral teachings, this is probably the one that is most ignored or criticized by those outside the church. And so within those groups, though, I would say that there are those who just don't know about this teaching. Maybe they've come from another Christian denomination, and a lot of Protestants never talk about this issue. It's not a moral issue for them. And so they just don't know. And honestly, you're not going to hear about this in a homily. I think I've only ever heard this mentioned in a homily maybe once by a priest. And so you're not going to hear it there. So if your RCIA skips it, or your marriage prep was really quick and easy and there wasn't any formation there, there's Catholics who just have literally never heard what this teaching is. The second group is they've heard of it, maybe from people outside the church, but they don't know why. It seems very arbitrary. Like, why is the church against condoms? I don't get it. And so that's the second group. Okay, the third one is those who get it, but then they say, no, it just seems too impractical. In this age, right, this kind of would start with in this era, right, we need something else. And so I'm going to assume that we have a whole mix in this room. I don't know where you guys are all at in your own formation on this issue or your own thoughts, but I'm going to assume that there's people from each group. And I think different information as we go through these slides is going to address everybody in this group kind of at different times. And so I'm going to kind of walk through this in a very intentional kind of step-by-step way. And so let's go to the next one here. So let's spell out the context. Okay, this is 1968, flower power. Okay, we got the hippie movement in full swing in the United States. the Western world. Europe got a little bit of a head start on the U.S. when it comes to this, but the Western world is kind of in an upheaval around moral sexual issues. And there's a strong push to just throw everything out. Religion has held us back. This is a kind of Freudian oppression of the sexual impulse that just needs to be unleashed. And we need to throw all the traditions and taboos we've had about sex out the window, and we'll be better off for it, especially women being better off for that. That's the kind of what's in the cultural air. Now, the church was not immune to this. There were a lot of people within the church, even high-ranking cardinals, that had started to really push for this. And so what happened was, in the late 50s, early 60s, while the Anglican Church, which is one of the largest outside of Catholicism, one of the largest global communions, it's the Church of England, but as we all know, England went quite a ways in their expansion. They changed their teaching on this moral issue. And so because they changed it, there was a lot of push for Catholics to do the same. And so there was a commission set up by a different pope, Pope St. John the 23rd, to study, have married couples, theologians, discuss and talk about this moral issue. That's the context. So here's at the beginning of his encyclical. Okay, we have these things he lists off. Okay, he says first there's a very real and palpable fear of overpopulation in the world. In the middle of the 1900s, this was everywhere. If you read theology from this time period, it must have been in the news every day. You know, there's too many people. And that was a big fear. And it's kind of understandable because the population did boom from like 1850 to 1950. You have a huge spike in the global population. But it's also ironic given some of the current crises that are going on, and we'll get to that at a later slide. But that's one of the big things culturally. There's a huge push for contraception, not just in the church or elsewhere, but to keep the population down. As a side note, did you know that the entire population of the world could fit in the state of Texas with 200 square feet for each person? It's kind of mind-blowing. It's kind of crazy that's true, but it's just an interesting fact there. There's a lot to go into the population thing we'll get to in a bit. But number two, okay, there was a growing respect for women's role in public life. In the 1800s, there was a lot of legal restrictions on what occupations women could have. And so in the middle of the 1900s, you start to see a greater appreciation for women's contribution outside the home. Okay. Number three, there's an increase in understanding how the marital act contributes to the unity and well-being of married couples, and how marital intimacy is beneficial for a husband and a wife in itself. Okay. Fourth, rapid development of contraceptive technology. And I want to be specific on this issue in particular, because I think sometimes students will ask questions. They think it's like a new thing. Contraception is not new by any stretch of the imagination. We have ancient Egyptian contraceptive methods, and they had different, whether it was medical, they tried to have little solvents and potions and things like that. And so the contraception and the idea of it is not new. This is not something the church is responding to as if it's like we've never seen this before. The church has always responded the same way, as saying this isn't a good thing. This is not a moral thing. But in this case, right, the game was changed at the advent of widely distributed condoms and the birth control pill. Particularly the pill really rocked people because it was something that people argued was different because it was medicinal. And so that was something that's happening at this time period. And then number five is the commission I had mentioned. A commission had been meeting together for almost 10 years discussing this issue. So that's the context of this encyclical. So the dissenting claim at the time is summed up in this, and you'll still hear this. I heard it from some of my college professors at a Catholic university, which is changing times require a changing moral theology. We got to change it up to meet the needs of the times. Number two, that the call of Christ to be open to life should be seen as a call in the totality of a marriage, not in each individual marital act. That was the moral argument made by the cardinals who were on the dissenting side of this commission, who said, no, we need to change the church teaching. That's the claim. It's still repeated in some Catholic universities today, and I'd imagine that's still going on. I'm not too far out of college. That was only 2015. So then the church's response can be summed up as this. The great gift of married love is free, it's total, it's faithful, and it's fruitful. So I'm going to say those again. Married love in its essence, like what makes it different from friendship, what makes it different from the love of a father and a son, a mother and a daughter, is it's free, total, faithful, fruitful. A lot of other loves have one of those aspects or two, but married love has this totality to it. And when you are making your marriage vows in a Catholic wedding, all of these are actually, you are asked directly throughout the process of the Mass, either before the Mass in your marriage prep, during the Mass, or in your own vows. You make this promise, right? Are you free, right? So one of the first things the priest asks at a wedding Mass is, are you here of your own volition? There's no kind of shotgun wedding happening. This isn't like you're being coerced for money. This is you are here freely. The gift of yourself is total, okay? You're not holding anything back. There's no part of your being that you're saying, I will give you most of myself. And that includes time. And so, right, yeah, I'm not going to give you 23 and a half years. I'm going to give you my whole self forever. And then lastly, you have the fruitful aspect, right? That this love is fruitful. That from its moment of creation, God designed married love to bear fruit and be the means by which new immortal beings come into the world. And when we really reframe the marital act in that way, we start to see why it's so important. We lose sight of this because we're so used to the kind of culture where we live in, where contraception is the norm, it's the expectation. And because of that, we lose sight that like this is primarily the means by which new immortal souls come into the world. And so that act has been set apart by God for this purpose, and that's a big deal. It's a big deal. And so that's a short, quick summary of kind of the response. Now let's get a little bit more into the weeds here. This is a quote from St. Paul VI here. With regard to physical, economic, psychological, and social conditions, responsible parenthood is exercised by those who prudently and generously decide to have more children, and by those who, for serious reasons and with due respect to moral precepts, decide not to have additional children for either a certain or an indefinite period of time. This is a quote from Humanae Vitae. One of the initial reactions, okay, and one of the spoofs of Catholic teaching on this is essentially the church just expects everybody to have, 12 kids. Like, is that the expectation? It's just kind of just pump out as many babies as you biologically can. That is not the church's teaching, nor has it ever been the church's teaching. And so in the encyclical, there's the intent behind, okay, couples wanting to plan their families responsibly is good. Yeah, that's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And so then the next slide, okay, you hear another quote from Pope. This is the corollary to it. So while the church doesn't say like, no, let God, take care of you. Like, don't use your reason at all, right? Don't plan anything. That's, it's not the church's teaching. However, right, the exercise of responsible parenthood that requires that husband and wife, keeping a right order of priorities, recognize their own duties toward God, themselves, their families, and human society. From this, it follows that they are not free to act as they choose in the service of transmitting life, as if it were wholly up to them to decide what is the right course to follow. Now, this is an extremely controversial statement because it goes against the very kind of doctrine of modern Western society, which is that sex is what we make it. We decide its meaning and its purpose. And what the Pope is saying here is that like we don't decide this purpose. This is something that we enter into. It doesn't enter into us, right? Like it's kind of like a cathedral that we're going into. And a cathedral has certain structures. It's built with a certain shape. And there's certain ritual times for it. And that's kind of what he's getting at here. Okay, let's go to the next slide here. So to sum up, maybe just kind of put those two things in a little bit simpler terminology. It's about responsibility, okay, responsible parenthood, but then also method, okay? So Humanae Vitae acknowledges the importance of prudence and responsible parenthood for couples. There's no recklessness in it, right? And the intent, even at the time, he even acknowledges in the encyclical, like the fear of overpopulation, that's something that should be taken into account. Like that was something in the time that, like he said, if this is a statistical problem, like that is something that Catholic couples should take into account. However, that doesn't justify the kind of then we will do whatever we want kind of attitude. And so that's where we get to method. So the method used to plan out your family and responsibly regulate births and like that technical, encyclical language must take into account the natural moral law, okay, so the natural moral law, and God's design for human sexuality, which are really one and the same. But the natural moral law are just moral principles obeying the ends of things, that things have a purpose. And this is where it's really, this encyclical gets to something very deep in the modern Western mind. The modern Western mind is very much of I define my reality, right? And we see the extremes of this, right, with kind of being able to choose your gender, right? That's kind of like this litmus test case for how much do I get to define about reality and about myself. But if you rewind the tape, okay, back to the early 1900s, this is the first moral issue that idea hit on. Is sex an objective thing? Is this a moral thing outside of me that I have to kind of follow a rhythm or a pattern? Or is it something that I can morph, kind of like Play-Doh, into whatever shape I want it to be? And as the culture slowly walked down this logic of, no, it's really something that I choose the meaning, I choose the purpose, we arrived at a kind of crazy place culturally. So next one, okay, two ends. Can somebody define the word end for me here? This is a kind of Aristotelian term. Yeah, goal. Okay, goal or objective towards which something is oriented. Okay, it's the purpose of a thing. That everything has a telos. Okay, it's something that we're ordered towards naturally, whether we like it or not. And so everything has a purpose, right? Food for nutrition, a baseball bat to hit a baseball. Okay, there's something ordered, and we can't really change that. It's in the nature of things. Okay, it's just the way it is, we might say. And so with the marital act, okay, in the Humanae Vitae, it says there's really two ends. There's two purposes that we can't change. There's nothing that we can really do to adjust it. But the two purposes and ends of the marital act are cooperating with God in the transmission of human life, and then also to express the marital vow of total, faithful, permanent, self-giving love. That these are the two ends for which the marital act was created, that this intimacy between husband and wife was designed. And so with these two ends, okay, you can kind of shorten it to procreation and unity. Okay, these are the two things that we can't invent. We can't come up with our own version of it, that these are the kind of doors to the cathedral, if you will. Right? Like by walking through those two doors, you're entering into the mystery as God designed it. And so what he's going to get into is our sexual acts and our behavior becomes problematic when we don't reverence the doors of that cathedral, that we don't go through those doors. We violate those ends. That's when it becomes an issue. And then what's going to become clear, hopefully, as we keep going, is that these two are interwoven. They're interwoven together. Some people will argue, and this is something that I wrote a long paper on in college. I had professors at my university that they wrote their books trying to kind of write some revisionist theology and say, no, we really only need the unitive end. And so their argument was that really a lot of things that the church says are immoral are actually moral because they give some kind of psychological unity for two people engaging in an act. They advocated for any number of things, whether it was cohabitation, same-sex acts, masturbation. They were like, we just need to change the whole book on it. And I think what they missed is that these two things go together. If married love, right, is meant to be expressed through the body, and that when a couple becomes one flesh, truly and actually, and that act is not just an arbitrary, like recreational activity a couple happens to do together. It actually has a meaning that's expressing the soul. Then that means that every time a couple is supposed to come together, it's supposed to be a renewal of the marital vows, right? Like the vows that you stand before God and your family and 100 other people. The vows you make before them in that moment is supposed to be ratified and renewed through the body in the marital act. That's the vision of God, that it's renewed each time. And so those are the two ends of the marital act. He continues on, he says, contraceptives violate, okay, both of those, okay, because the unitive and the procreative are inseparable. It might be obvious, right, how procreation would violate the procreative end, right? That like it's kind of obvious. Okay, well, yeah, if you're deliberately trying to obstruct the possibility of conceiving a child, which is the definition of contraception would be any act deliberately taken before, during, or after the act of becoming one flesh to try to impede the conception of a child, right? Then that's obvious. But the unitive is not so clear. And what JP2, our patron over at the high school, wrote about for 6 years, when he first became Pope, he talked about this very issue, not just contraception, but marriage itself, for 6 years from the balcony of St. Peter's. Every Wednesday, the Pope gives an audience. It's kind of a prepared talk, like a very long sermon. And he gave a series of talks. They were all connected for 6 years, right when he became Pope, all about this stuff, all about sex and marriage. And they were collected in this volume that is typically called the Theology of the Body. And it's a pretty dense read. If you guys know anything about JP2, he had multiple doctorates, one in philosophy, one in theology. He was a brilliant man, and it's pretty deep theology and philosophy. But what he really got at in this theological anthropology is that in the gift of a husband and wife to themselves, it's not just a procreative end that has to be upheld, but it's the unitive. That in giving oneself, that includes the capacity to bring new life into the world. That when which every married couple wants to do, those in the church, outside the church, you want to express that love bodily. That's going to incorporate the chance of bringing new immortal beings into the world, because that's an essential part of who we are. We can't bracket off our fertility and say like, that's not really a part of what we're doing here. And so it's an essential part of that love. And so they're really, they're woven together. And so by deliberately acting against these ends, God's design for marital intimacy is frustrated and the order of nature is gravely violated. That's what Humanae Vitae goes into, that like it's kind of like this a misuse of, and kind of how JP2 would say it's not speaking the language of the body properly. That the language of the body is designed to express that unitive love and that procreative element, which is just openness to life, right? Procreative element does not mean you're intending to have a child. I always tell the seniors, it's like the Catholic vision of, married, sexual life is not, hello, Janice, let's make a baby, right? It's like some Dwight Schrute, if you guys know The Office, like that kind of, like him and Angela, kind of like that weirdness. That's not what the church pictures, right? But it's an openness to cooperate with God if he would so give us life in that moment. Okay, let's go to the next one here. So we've talked about the parameters. What is this encyclical and the church in general pitch as the alternative? Right? We talked about methods that would be artificial and kind of deliberately obstructing the ends. Well, what method of family planning would be respectful of the natural law and then also of God's design? What's natural family planning is what it's typically called. Okay, and so this is based on observing the pattern that God put into his own creation. It's observing the kind of laws and rhythms of God's creation itself, particularly in the fertility of human beings, of men and women. And so by respecting God's design for sexual intimacy and creation, by upholding each act as an honest expression of a married love. That's kind of the goal, the philosophy of natural family planning. It's to plan out your family prudently and with wisdom, but while still reverencing these laws. Now, what is this going to require? Well, it's going to require a lot of communication. It's going to require self-control. It's going to require a lot of prudence, and it's going to require times of short abstinence. Is that easier or harder than just going to, the drugstore and buying a condom or getting on the pill? It is harder, right? But if we're entering the church, we're following Christ, expecting something to be super easy, I don't think that we're going to be in for a surprise, right? That there's always a call to a death to self, but that death to self always leads to a resurrection. It's a joyful cross. And I will say, I think in my experience, this is a big difference because this teaching is very different, received differently, I should say, by different generations. I think the church, initially after Humanae Vitae, there was so much of a reaction against it. And there was also such a unwillingness of bishops and priests to really teach it well that it wasn't received by many people, particularly in the generation following the council in the 70s and the 80s. And somewhere along the line that started to switch. There started to be a recognition by the church, at least, and I'm speaking in the West of like Europe and America, where there started to be a recognition of like, maybe we should like try to educate people and married couples on this, and maybe it'll actually help their marriages. Maybe this is actually going to be a good thing. And so my wife and I got married through a marriage prep program that was very big on this. And every married couple I know that's near our age has a really big formation on this. I heard about this in college, heard about it through mentors and through other married couples that had gotten married a couple years before us. And nearly every young Catholic married couple I know like practices this, and they wouldn't say it's easy. It's it's just a walk in the park, but they would say it's like this joyful thing. It's something that's helped their marriage overall because of the communication element, because of the intimacy that's required to be able to kind of take up this burden together. Of occasionally we're gonna have to abstain. Okay, let's go to the next slide here. So I'm gonna get into just a little bit of the basics of natural family planning. I'm not like a certified diocesan NFP trainer or anything. That's not what I'm here for. But it will help kind of give you an idea of what this is, because one of the things that I've heard before is some people will like ask, they'll be like, is NFP, that's just like, it's kind of like the rhythm method, which is what it used to be called like in like before the 1950s. And even then that wasn't really taught very well. And that was, the rhythm method was kind of a name for kind of a general approach to like women's fertility, of kind of like an average woman's body kind of thing. And there was a little bit of guesswork. Even then, a lot of people received it as kind of like, they didn't look into the details of it as much. When we talk about natural family planning, it's a very specific approach to this. It's very based on an individual body, and it's based on individual times. And so, anyways, in the average cycle here of fertility in a woman's body, right, you have kind of a fertile period, okay? And when you're practicing NFP, if you're to be planning a family, and for reasons whether they're economic or psychological, whatever they are, discerning that we shouldn't have a child right now. When you make that decision, the church say, okay, we'll follow NFP. What that would mean is you would learn this, right? And a part of actually marriage prep today is learning this. Very few Catholic couples actually can get married without knowing this now. I know, at least in America, most dioceses make this required. And what it involves is just kind of getting to know the natural rhythm of fertility that is planted and creation by God. And so these are kind of the fertile days, I guess you'd say, where the church say, okay, those few days a month, there's going to be a required abstinence if you're going to try and plan out your family. And so I think a lot of people, honestly, outside the church don't know anything about this. At least it seems for our students at our high school, a lot of the parents are surprised to learn a lot of the details about like what NFP is, because it's just not taught. This is not taught in like sex ed in public schools. This is not free knowledge, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. It's crazy that you could take your teenage daughter to the doctors and they would have no problem prescribing them a birth control pill, because they're like, well, she's probably gonna be hooking up with guys in a few years, so you might as well just put her on it now. It's crazy that we do that instead of actually educating young people about just reality, like the biological reality of their bodies. It seems like a crime that we wouldn't teach them that. But anyways, in this phases, we call it kind of the fertile days, and you have ovulation, and that's kind of where NFP is going to come in. Is how do you track an individual woman's path through the fertility cycle? So go ahead and go to the next slide here. So there's a few different methods. Okay, if you're looking into practicing this, maybe you're in the room kind of saying, I've never heard of this, but I'm willing to look into it. Or if maybe you're thinking about a future marriage, maybe preparing for marriage, and you haven't heard of it yet, these are a few methods you hear about: the Billings method, the Creighton method, and the Marquette method. They all involve one of these elements. One, sensing the change in the basal body temperature. This would involve like taking temperature, wife taking a temperature every morning, and then at the time when she's about to ovulate, there will be a noticeable increase in temperature. And then mucus changes, charting so that you see a regularity in pattern, because each woman's body is going to be a little bit different. Then also there's like tests that they make now. And so this would be the Marquette method involves this. These tests are like pregnancy tests. You track the hormonal change of the first fertility cycle. And so for my wife and I personally, we've practiced the Marquette method after my last son Declan was born a few years ago. Afterwards we were like, yeah, I think we should practice NFP for this period now. And so after we had that discussion, we started using the Marquette method. It was very effective. You take the tests, up until ovulation day, and it kind of tells you where she's in that kind of fertility wave of hormones, and you can know the ovulation to the day. And it's very effective. It's very specific to the individual woman, so it's not really guesswork. You could approach this as guesswork if you don't do the work, I guess you could say. You could just kind of get an app, that's a general fertility app, and just say, what is the average woman's cycle like, and then you kind of go based on that. But that's a lot of guessing. This is what is taught in the church is a very specific, holistic kind of medicine approach to this. And so that's just a preview of some of these forms of natural family planning. All of them, there's many people around our country and the world who use all three of those methods. I like the Marquette method for its surety and stuff, but yeah, we go to the next one. Okay, so now we're going to move into Humanae Vitae's fulfilled prophecies. Okay, so we've kind of talked about the personal element, and I'm going to come back to it at the very end. Because Humanae Vitae is one of those encyclicals where this is a very personal thing. It's a very, very personal topic of talking about the intimacy between husband and wife. But the things that he talks about also has a large-scale societal effect. And this is where I really want to pull in those people who maybe don't agree with this teaching. They don't see how practical it is. They don't see how, why is this something that, why is this not just some obscure thing off to the side? Why is it such a central issue? That's what we're going to get to in this next slide here. So he has a few main prophecies, predictions. First, he says, this is in 1968, in 1968, guys, over 70% of Americans were going to some form of church service every single Sunday. That's 1968. Had, a wave of change already? Yes, but this is a different culture. It's over 7%. You guys know what the number is now? It's below 30 now. It's a big decline, which the United States is miles ahead of most European nations. In France, it's under 8% of people go to some form of church every Sunday. And so this is a different culture. Okay? This is like a culture on the tipping point here. This is a culture where most marriages, aren't ending in divorce. This is a culture where a hookup culture is still kind of miles away. That's like a fringe thing. And so anyways, these are his predictions. If contraception is normalized in, we'll say, the Western world, Europe and America, these are what I expect to happen. An increase in marital infidelity, which makes sense, right? One of the deterrents, if it wasn't love and morality from marital infidelity, is the risk of having a child with somebody else, right? If you're a guy, you're going to now have to support this child. If you're a woman, it's going to be hard to hide that from your family. And so that was like a natural barrier to marital infidelity. Well, if you normalize it, and it's in the air now, it's going to increase marital infidelity. Number two, the lowering of moral standards. Just across the board, there's going to be kind of a decrease in people's standards of behavior, especially regarding sexual issues and sexual ethics. Number three, there's going to be a decrease in respect for women and an increase in their objectification as a culture. He predicts that this is going to be, if contraception is normalized, women are going to be treated as objects far more, because now instead of being seen as persons who are capable of bringing other persons into the world, they're going to be sexual objects just for the pleasure of men. And number four, kind of a bold prediction. He says governments and public authorities will begin mandating contraception. What's going to stop a government from saying, we think this is in the best interest of you to have this contraception? So those are four predictions. Needless to say, he was very right on every score here. And I'm going to walk through exactly how he was right. So it's 57 years, almost. He wrote it in the summer. And so we're at about 56 years since Humanae Vitae was released. We have a complete collapse of marriage rates. We have a complete collapse in fertility rates, and just the nuclear family in general has really been denigrated. You can see this in a lot of the ideology pushed even into school curriculums today, redefining what a family is. I was in some education classes where we were not supposed to assume students had a mom and a dad. We were told, don't say mom and dad until you know a kid doesn't have two moms or two dads. Don't say any language that assumes a nuclear family. If you're learning that in an education class at a Catholic school, that's a problem. That's a big problem for a culture. And so talking about marriage rates, I always tell the seniors, I'm like, do you guys realize that actually divorce rates are on the decline? Right? This is a good thing. Divorce rates are going down. people are staying together. And they say, oh, that sounds like good news. And I'm like, well, that's the good news. The bad news is people are getting married at record low rates. Like, people are just not getting married anymore. In my generation, the millennial generation, and in Gen Z, there are more than 50% of people just deciding not to get married. That's a big problem for a civilization to have, that most people are saying we're gonna go a different route than the nuclear family. And so that's a huge issue. And obviously connected to that is plummeting fertility rates. I don't know if have you guys heard of the demographic winter, that kind of idea? Is this you guys are familiar with? This is a big problem, and this is kind of ironic given the kind of manic episode that people were having in the middle of the 1900s about, like, we're gonna have too many people. Well, now we are begging. There are countries in Europe who are paying people to have babies. There are women in Asian countries who are literally paid just to have random men's babies, to keep the population at a replacement level. There's a certain number of babies that a culture has to have to maintain what's called replacement level, and it's 2.1 children per woman. Like, across a whole society, there's going to be 2.1 children per woman to maintain a population. The United States has been below that number for over 10 years. And we are not the only ones. We're actually doing okay compared to places like England and Italy. South Korea is half of the replacement level. Like, that's how few children are being born. And I say born, not conceived, because another element of this is abortion. So complete collapse in fertility rates. Obviously, the nuclear family has taken a hit just ideologically. I would imagine we're going to see some changes in U.S. policy on this pretty soon. We're going to start mimicking some of these Eastern European countries. There's Eastern European countries that say, if you get married, we're gonna give you a help to buy a house. But if you're cohabiting, we're not going to do the same thing. If you have more than 3 kids, you will never pay taxes for the rest of your life. There are these financial incentives already happening in European countries because they're essentially begging people, please have children, please continue the human race. And obviously it's not the goodwill of governments necessarily doing that. It's their own self-interest, because they know that just from a workforce perspective, if the majority of your workforce begins to be over 40, you're going to have a massive economic crisis, because who is going to pay for all of the healthcare and all of the Social Security for those who cannot work anymore? And so there's a huge issue with that. It makes it so ironic that when this encyclical was written, people were saying there's too many people. Now it's like, please have babies, And that was 56 years ago. That changed. Second, for the second prediction, hookup culture has become a big issue on college campuses. Sometimes I show these seniors these videos and they see it on their own time anyway. There's videos online where people will go around to college campuses and they'll talk about body count. I don't know if you guys have heard of this phrase. It's kind of like a modern terminology to say, like, how many people have you slept with? And they just ask random people on a college campus, like, what's your body count? What's your body count? The numbers would shock you. And I show it to the kids just to show them, especially the ones that have been in a little bit of a Catholic school bubble their whole life. They're in for a wake-up call in terms of how people approach relationships once they get to college. And so hookup culture is a huge issue. In our country alone, you have 1 million abortions. Between chemical and procedural abortions, it's 1 million abortions. It's a mind-blowing number. It's almost too big to look at. You almost have to focus on other issues, because if we really thought about it, be horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying. So in terms of overall moral decline, right? Abortion wasn't even legal in America when this encyclical was released. Now you have 1 million a year. That's the expected number. If it's anything less than 1 million, it's like, wow, we really made a stride. Number 3, the objectification of women. We have a massive pornography epidemic, especially being around young people and young men, and now young women. This is a huge issue. The advent of social media, different forms of social media, different apps, along with just the decline in mental health perpetuated by that, has led a lot of young people into this kind of vicious cycle of depression, anxiety, pornography, and they are sick of it. They are aware of it, they don't want to be in it, but it hurts. And they're kind of screwed because, a lot of them were given, foolishly or not, or, just people not realizing the impact this would have, but they receive a device at, the beginning of their pubescent years, now with the world at their fingertips, anything their fingertips, and they're addicted by the time they're 13, 14. They're 8th graders, and they've seen things that a kid in the 80s couldn't even imagine. And so that's a big issue. And the mental health issue for women is even bigger. The rates, I don't know if you guys have seen statistics for young women from 13 all the way through college age. The mental health, the number of women medicated for anxiety and depression is so sad. And do we think that that's really unconnected to how they're being seen as a society when there's just constant images in their face of women being objectified? And not only objectified, but being celebrated. That's a path of freedom. When you see a woman doing this, that's liberation. That's what you should do. So not only do they get to feel not sufficient with their body image, but they get to feel that they're also approved for not doing it. And so there's a guilt associated with it. It's a terrible combination. So number 3, I would say, is certainly come true. Number 4 is a really interesting one, the government mandate. I don't know if you guys remember, there was a huge, battle with Catholic institutions and a couple others like Hobby Lobby that sued the Obama administration. Because under the healthcare law that went into place under Obama, there was a mandate that all employers have to provide contraception, including abortifacient Plan B contraception, for all their employees. Catholic institutions said, "We're not doing that. That's not in our conscience to do that." And the government said, "Too bad. You're going to do it anyway. Suck it up." And so that court case went on for years. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. It was Little Sisters of the Poor, kind of at the flagship of it. And in, I believe it was 2017, it was finally decided, and it was actually decided in favor of the Catholic institution, saying you don't have to provide this under the law of the United States. It's no longer required. This fits under a conscientious objection for you. And so that was a big win for religious freedom in the United States, but it's also a good example of how, in the eyes of the world, people are just kind of saying, because it's in the air, like, what's the big deal? Like, why can't these sisters who are serving the elderly in these retirement homes, why can't they provide, Plan B for their employees? It wasn't even seen as an issue, whereas from a moral perspective, that should kind of horrify us that a government's even trying to do that. That it's such a basic right in the United States that it was seen as fine. The other one that we see is, this one is not talked about a lot, but there's a lot of philanthropists that they have a little ideological quid pro quo going with African nations where they say, we got a lot of money. You need a lot of money. How about you start sterilizing yourselves and then we'll give you the money. And it's really bad. You're talking about like forced sterilization of women and massive distribution of contraceptive education for African people who to them this is foreign. Even the non-Catholic Africans, this is a foreign thing that they don't approve of, and yet it's being pushed on them by rich white liberals in America. And so you have that kind of thing going on. Again, somebody in 1968 probably saw Pope Paul's prophecies as a little bit, the sky is falling. It's not going to be that bad. This is not going to have a catastrophic impact on Western civilization. And I'm obviously not saying that all of this is due to contraception. There's many factors, socioeconomic, moral, cultural, that have contributed to these things. It's not all from one thing. However, I think we would absolutely be blind as a culture to say that contraception didn't have anything to do with each of these. Each of these things was enabled by an attitude that said, sex is what we make it. It's something that we decide. It's something that we make in our own image. We can decide its meaning and purpose, and when we do that, we'll be happier. That philosophy very quickly kind of led down this road to these fulfilled prophecies. So let's go to the next slide here. And we see here, so I really focus on this for a second. Here we just see like an example. This is from a news story of one of the drag queen story hours. You had maybe heard about a couple years ago. It became a thing. So there's some kids holding up the new pride flag. A lot of people see this type of thing, and I've heard so many like political commentators say something along these lines. How did we get here? Like, how did we get to the point where if I take my kid to the local public library, there's going to be a drag queen there reading, green eggs and ham? It does kind of baffle you, and a lot of people are uncomfortable with it. But what I want you guys to see the connection with is that it's the same logic that if we just rewind the tape You walk it back to the 60s. You walk it back before the 60s. And that philosophy that said, there's an objective order in nature that God put there that we should follow, that like we're not bigger than sex and gender, it's bigger than us and we have to participate in it. We have to enter into it. That attitude was switched for sex is what I make it. If you want to make it just about marriage, that's cool for you. But for me, it's something else. When we started to normalize that in the Western world, it slowly led down this path of, well, who am I to say anything, about this and then that? And then eventually you have a culture where we are willing to say, yeah, actually there are more than two genders. I had in another one of my education classes, a group come in from GLAAD, which is one of the most vehement, kind of pro-LGBT ideology organizations in the US. And they told us, like, there are more than two genders. They had showed us a little unicorn penguin and unicorn, or the gender unicorn and the kind of gender penguin and these little symbols. It felt like we were in third grade being shown these little cartoons. And they said, this is the truth and this is what you ought to teach your second grade. And I remember asking, this is back in 2019, I asked, like, is there an age, like where you guys would say, nah, a kid just doesn't know what they're talking about on this? And she said, nope, there isn't. At any age, if a kid says, like, no, I'm not a boy, I'm not a girl, we should reverence that. And it's amazing. It's amazing because you get to that point and a sane person goes, how did we get here? Like, how did we get to the point where a kid can say that we're adults in a room of higher education saying that, like, no, actually the 5-year-old who, probably can't be trusted to use the stove, like, can choose to take hormones that will mutilate their body forever. Like, that's crazy, right? But if we walk it back, you just start walking it back, that same kind of core philosophy is what Pope Paul was talking about in the 60s with Humanae Vitae. I think a lot of people, they react and they say, like, this is too far, but if you follow the logic back to its origin, we have to acknowledge that it's the same core. Either there is kind of a pattern in nature, a beautiful one and a grand one with sex that God has put into it for our good and the good of other people. And we either kind of enter into it or we say, no, it's really something that I can kind of shape and form according to my own whims. And contraception was the technology. When we got really good at contracepting through the pill and through condoms, it became a method by which we can now reshape intimacy. Okay, we can reshape intimacy according to our own plans and kind of designs. And that kind of logic is kind of how we got here. But that philosophy here, right, that it's an activity that gets its meaning and purpose from my private desires and will, that sums it up. I mean, that's kind of how we educate kids in the public school system today on sex, right? Is that's what we tell them. Like, this is something that, like, your religion, your philosophy might dictate this belief or that, but ultimately it's what you make it. And that's what Pope Paul is trying to fight against way back 56 years ago when things seemed to be kind of hunky-dory. Oh, almost everybody's going to church. Marriages are pretty healthy. Like, that's what he's trying to fight off, saying, like, I can see it on the horizon. We're about to enter into a kind of, twilight zone. Anyways, if you're looking to read more about this, and I highly recommend you do, this is something that, I'm just giving you a very intro. We're going to do a Q&A in a minute on this topic. But if you're looking for books where to start, these three are phenomenal. First is Christopher West. It's The Good News About Sex and Marriage. It's a Q&A book just on these questions. So the whole book is just moral questions of, like, what about this? Like, what about this? Are Catholics okay with this? Thumbs up or thumbs down? And the whole book it gives explanations, gives the logic, and it does talk about contraception in there. Okay. This book changed my worldview a lot. It's called Adam and Eve After the Pill. It's by a woman named Mary Eberstadt. She is not a theologian. She's not a philosopher, but she's a sociologist. And so sociologists, they study these trends in society. And her fascination was, as she was writing, and she was kind of in secular journalism for a long time, from New York Times, things like that, she started to notice something about feminist literature that she was reading from a lot of her fellow writers and stuff. And in general, there was just a massive wave of unhappiness, and she started to become very curious about when did this start. And so she started getting into the sociology studies. And she talks about how really if you if you go back culturally in the West, you just keep kind of tracing back, like when did things really start to change? She points to the pill and contraception as kind of this turning point of societal dynamics. And again, she's not trying to scapegoat this one thing, saying that's the only cause. She talks about a bunch of things that are the causes. But for her, this is kind of the genesis point of kind of our change in attitude towards a lot of things, that we've kind of conquered nature, we can now manipulate it. And then her big point, though, is that we're all less happy. She looked at every demographic: young men, old men, young women, old women, women who are married, men who are married, women who are unmarried, women who are formerly married, men who are formerly married. Across the board, the self-reported happiness has gotten lower with each subsequent generation. Like this, just the self-reported, like, how is your satisfaction with life? Scale of 1 to 10. How is your satisfaction with your spouse? 1 to 10. How is your satisfaction with your sexual life? 1 to 10. And all of them have declined decade by decade. And so that fascinated her, especially because all these changes that happened in the 60s were done in the name of happiness, right? Like the whole idea was that if we do this, everybody's going to be happier, especially women. And her point from a sociological point of view is that like the opposite has happened. We've only made ourselves less happy. And so to her, it's this kind of this mystery, but it's called Adam and Eve After the Pill. Phenomenal book. It's a short book, but it's mostly just kind of statistics and surveys looking at each demographic, looking at other things as well. How she kind of compares how Americans have changed their attitude towards food and like communal meals and sex. That there's been like a concurrent change of how we approach food and sex. Like we've changed the way that we've done that. It's become less personal, less intimate over time at the same time. The other one, this is called Men, Women, and the Mystery of Love. This is by a guy, Dr. Sri. He's a phenomenal theologian. He's kind of giving a much easier to read version of the theology of the body. So those texts that JP2 wrote and said at the start of his papacy for 6 years, he kind of writes a summary because those texts are dense, and also JP2 wrote in Polish. And Polish to English is sometimes a rough translation to read. If you want something a little more scholarly, I would actually go from here to a book called Love and Responsibility, which is a book that JP2 wrote actually even before Humanae Vitae. It had an impact on Humanae Vitae. He was on the commission. And it's kind of a long form study of marriage and like marital love, of like what is falling in love? Like what is that phenomenon? Why did God give it to us, and what's it supposed to look like? So that book is called Love and Responsibility, but just fair warning, it is a bit of a tougher read. It's pretty dense. If you're looking for a more accessible point, this one gets the same content in a much more accessible way. And so those are 3 books definitely recommend reading. And you can also find articles if you're not looking to get into a full-length book or like novel on this topic. Plenty of YouTube videos, great sources from like Bishop Barron, Father Schmitz, like just 10-minute videos that can talk about this in a way that maybe is a little bit like better for you than what I'm saying now. And not only that, but then articles. So like Mary Eberstadt's written so many articles on this topic as well, of like specifically declining female happiness, and kind of the impact of the sexual revolution on young people today, of like how they're working through it. How do 21-year-olds maneuver through the kind of wreckage of the sexual revolution? And if you ask somebody in high school or college today, just ask them, what is dating like today? Just watch what they say, watch how they react. And you'll see like it's tough. It's tough for a lot of people because the norms have been thrown out. There's a lack of belief in love. When I first teach this to my seniors, I always say the church still believes in love. The church still believes in romance. We live in a really cynical society when it comes to that. Like we're a post-love, a kind of post-marriage, a kind of post-happily ever after society. And the church still says, nope. It's possible. It's hard, but it's possible. Happily ever after doesn't mean there's no work. Of course, marriage is work. All of you guys who are married know like how much work marriage is to keep it like healthy and thriving. But that work doesn't mean it's not joyful. And crosses that God gives us always lead to a resurrection, and they are joyful to carry with Him. And God is always with us. And so as you're, maybe leaving tonight, thinking about this, maybe this is new to you, maybe it's something that like you're still wrestling with, like internally, this is not something that like, you're like, I don't know, just I still have qualms with it. That's okay. Know that like Christ is with you walking through that kind of wrestling. And the beauty of the church is redemption, right? That's the whole Christian story, is redemption, in that He's with us in the midst of our wrestling, in the midst of our struggles, and that mercy and in the ability to just start new it's always available to us. And so that's all I have.